In this chapter, we'll look at a couple of basic framing techniques that are worth making into a habit. The first is dividing the frame in thirds. In this external shot, there's given no priority to any character, and we're spending a good portion of the frame shooting the back of the man's head. So let's divide the frame into thirds, and give 2/3 to the woman and 1/3 to the man. We'll do the same in the matching reverse. As we cut back and forth, the character in focus has the major part of the frame. In close-up or internal shots, we'll again give 2/3 of the frame to the character in focus, but instead leave 1/3 of empty space in front. As we cut back and forth between all 4 cameras, the framing is balanced. Dividing the frame in thirds is a carryover from paintings and is not as much a rule as a helpful guideline to create pleasing framings. Placing characters at the center looks like a vacation photo because the only goal is to get a picture of the person. Framing in thirds, or at least placing the characters off-center, is instantly more picturesque. But since we're keeping the characters off-center, let's look a little more closely at the effect of which side of the character we put the empty space on. First of all, characters seem more open or available when they have more space in front of them. If we frame her like this instead, the frame cuts off her personal space and we're not being let in. Here the frame cuts off the man's space, so we're again not being let in. If we frame him like this instead, he might be turned away from the other character, but we're being let into his space. That's one way to look at it, but another way is to see it as if we're framing either for the shared space between the characters or for the private space behind them. Framing for the space between the characters creates intimacy. As we cut between the man and the woman, they seem normally involved with each other. If we frame for the space behind the woman, she seems to reject being part of the shared space, while the man is still part of the shared space. If we also frame him for the space behind him, they're now both rejecting being part of the shared space. Directing whether we're framing for the space inside or outside the dialogue can create very effective emotional statements. Center framing works best when a character is supposed to be head-on and own the frame. Here the man is very direct in center stage, so the most meaningful place to put him is dead center. Another good reason to place a character in the center is when he's a neutral third party. Here we're cutting between the women, and each have part of the shared space in their shot. As we cut to the man, he's equally part of both their spaces. Vertical framing for characters simply involves keeping a bit of empty space above the head. As we get closer, we'll have less space above her head than in wider shots. In close shots, it's more a matter of where to place the eyes. Here it can still work to frame in thirds, in which case we'll place her eyes on the third line. The concern is visual gravity. If we put too much space above the characters, the framing can seem too light. If we put too little space above the characters, the framing can seem too heavy. A little bit of space tends to feel at ease. Here the frame is top-heavy. By having the contents gravitate towards the bottom, we get a more relaxed and settled framing. Another factor in framing is perspective. There's lots of theory on perspective, but to make a long story short, leaning lines in the image create a sense of depth. Here the angle on the boxes causes plenty of leaning lines, both into the depth of the frame and also over on the left. If we instead move over here, we're shooting flat against the boxes, all the lines are completely horizontal, and we have no sense of depth. So shooting flat against any surface is something to avoid when we can. Lines in the image create perspective when they're moving towards a vanishing point. Here the vanishing point is inside the frame, which creates the hardest perspective. A more relaxed perspective is created by placing the vanishing point outside the frame, causing the lines to lean in that direction. So if we want to shoot a dialogue scene between these two rows of crates, this way of setting it up will give us almost no perspective. Since the cameras are not angled completely flat on the crates, we're getting a bit of perspective, but only a little bit. However, as we rotate the entire setup to get more perspective, we're running into a typical problem. One of the cameras now has more perspective, but the other one is shooting directly into the wall. In this scene, an obvious way to get perspective in both cameras is to place the characters parallel to the crates. Now we're getting perspective in both shots. Another convention from painting is that perspective lines guide the eye through the frame. Here the lines lead us towards the man. Nothing makes this clearer than placing the character dead center in the frame with all perspective lines symmetrical around him. Since photography is about forcing a three-dimensional world onto two-dimensional film, it's important that we do everything we can to retain a sense of perspective. If we take out what creates the perspective lines, we remove any sense of depth. One last consideration is where to place the horizon line, which is the ultimate vanishing point. Not all shots have a clear horizon line, so it doesn't always apply. But when there is one, the photographic convention is to place it on one of the vertical thirds, either here or here, depending on what's important in the shot.